First of all, thanks for having me here. Very excited to be here. Super fun. And I know I'm between you and a bathroom break, so I'm going to try and keep this really animated. I'm going to actually try to synthesize here two different streams of research. I do a lot of research on innovation. I do all my research on innovation, really. And the last 10 years, I've been really focused on breakthrough innovation because I personally find it very interesting. There's two major streams that I've been working on. One is about breakthrough innovators. So I started a project about 7 years ago looking at serial breakthrough innovators. These are people who have multiple breakthroughs over time throughout their lives, which is important because people can be one-hit wonders, and if you really want to isolate something that's specific to a person, you'd rather see someone who's innovated over and over and over again because you might have a little bit more faith that it had something to do with them. And so I created this case sampling technique where we scraped lists of most famous innovators, and people had to show up on there multiple times, multiple lists, for multiple innovations. It had to have multiple biographies written about them, and it had to be English sources. And so you get people who are mostly male from Western locations, and that's just the artifact of history and the history of education and the history of women's rights and the history of minority rights. But this got too big to be a paper, so this is in a book now called Quirky. I didn't actually give it that title, but it fits. So I'm going to try and talk a little bit about that, which is the similarities, the commonalities, and the differences among people who are serial breakthrough innovators. And then I'm also going to talk about another stream of research, which is going to be more behavioral, you'll see in a minute, that's really about the structure of cognition and how we identify breakthrough opportunities. So it's going to be based more on, it's going to be a bunch of data in this one, and on sort of a technological landscape idea. So I'm going to start with the first one, and that is when you look at breakthrough innovation, there's at least three main parts that have to happen. There has to be heterodox thinking and creativity to come up with an idea. There has to be effort and persistence, because breakthrough ideas are hard to give birth to. The world resists. They try to push them back in, right? I didn't really think about how that metaphor would look in my head until just now. And there has to be a fair amount of situational advantage, or there very often at least is a fair amount of situational advantage. And what I found looking at these people was a number of factors that contributed to these different pieces. And I'm going to talk about these three pieces here today as sort of the behavioral and experience, you could say trait, but it's risky saying trait in case there's any personality people in the room, that contribute to this heterodox thinking and creativity, and to some extent the effort and persistence part. So I'm going to start with separateness. This is something really strange because I didn't go looking for this. I was actually doing a lot of stuff on networks before I started this project. So I was really expecting innovators to have these really replete networks. I thought they might be sort of extroverted and make lots of interesting idiosyncratic friends. And what I found was actually the loneliest frickin' group of people you've ever met in your life, right? Socially detached, awkward people. And at some point, when you see it over and over and over again, at some point you think it's probably not a coincidence. So let's try to understand what the mechanism is at play here. And these people often, they felt odd, or they felt isolated. They felt like the rules didn't apply to them. Sometimes they were mechanically separated from people, either through illness or deafness, like Edison, for example. Sometimes it was depression. Sometimes it was... It could be a lot of things. Sometimes there's a general dislike of people. And Einstein is the person who probably spoke about it the most articulately and really saw its role in his life, and both the positives and the negatives. And he has this great quote where he says, "My passionate sense of social justice and social responsibility has always contrasted oddly with my pronounced freedom from the need for direct contact with other human beings." Right? And human communities. I gang my own gait and have never belonged to my country, my home, my friends, or even my immediate family with my whole heart. In the face of all these ties, I have never lost an obstinate sense of detachment, of the need for solitude. Such a person no doubt loses something in the way of geniality and lightheartedness. But on the other hand, and this is key, he is largely independent of the opinions, habits, and judgments of his fellow, and avoids the temptation to take his stand on such insecure foundations. So you actually see this over and over and over again. People like Jobs, his girlfriend considered him wooden and to be sort of emotionally dysfunctional. People like Elon Musk, who's sometimes considered, as a child, they actually thought he might be deaf, and then people have speculated on whether he was a little autistic. People speculated on whether Einstein was a little autistic, or people like Marie Curie, who was chronically depressed, and then was considered a very disagreeable, obstinate woman. But you know what? To get breakthrough innovation to happen, you have to be a bit disagreeable. You have to be a bit willing to be disliked. You have to be willing to say, screw you, I'm going to do it anyway, right? So I think there's actually a very important benefit of being not such a team player for some of these people to be breakthrough innovators, which is not saying we want everybody to be social pariahs. I have different implications later on for how we can tap this without becoming social pariahs. But if you are a social pariah, here's the good news. So, the benefits, on the one hand, it's going to give you time and liberty to pursue your own interests, to be an autonomous thinker, to be independent, to be less prone to conform to social norms. On the con side, it can be harder to get access to resources, to gain legitimacy, to disseminate your ideas, so there's pros and cons. And so what you see when you actually start studying these people is that the penalty of being socially awkward or separate is different depending on how much social collaboration you need to bring your innovation to the world. So for instance, Marie Curie could work in a lab and she could be disliked by other scientists or not accepted, at least by other scientists, because women weren't supposed to be scientists, then what the hell was she doing trying to be a scientist, right? But when she held up radium, it frickin' glowed. It glowed, right? There was no denying it. Now, on the other hand, Benjamin Franklin, a lot of his innovations required a tremendous amount of social cooperation, and he had to get that cooperation in advance of being able to show people that it would have benefits. Things like libraries, street sweeping programs, volunteer fire departments, all these things he created. And so he cultivated the art of being persuasive. He actively worked on being less difficult and on being likable. So it's interesting that separateness is going to have different benefits and costs depending on the context. Here's another one that came up over and over and over again, not a surprise when you think about it, extreme self-efficacy. And the icon of contemporary innovators of extreme self-efficacy has got to be Elon Musk. And this is a guy who at the age of 12 already sold his first software game. And I have a 12-year-old at home, and I'm looking at him, and I'm thinking, man, there's no way my kid could sell a software game. And when he created his software game, there wasn't any I keep using the word frickin'. I've been hanging around my kids too much. There wasn't any internet, right? So today, if you wanted to learn how to design a software game, there's probably a MOOC for that. You could go on YouTube. You could work it all out. It's all there at your fingertips, and it would still be hard. But he did it in the days of DOS. And if you remember DOS, that's hard. So he, at 12, invents a software game, and then later after he sells Zip2 and X.com was instrumental in developing PayPal. He's got, about $180 million, and he could just retire at that point, right? He could go sit on an island, drink mojitos, and, lay around the rest of his life. But it's not his nature, right? He's a worker dog. He needs to work. He needs to be driven and inspired. So he decides, what can I do that would benefit humanity the most? And he starts thinking about energy problems and finite energy and cataclysmic events that could hit the Earth. And pretty soon he concludes that he needs to help create an electric car company to use energy more sustainably, a solar panel company to help create energy renewably. He actually designed the whole business plan of Solar City and then gave that to his cousins. And then, you know what? We better have a backup plan, and that backup plan is Mars, all right? Because this planet may go to hell no matter what. So he says he's going to build a space company. He's going to go to space, and not only is he going to have the impudence to go to space, he's going to invent reusable rockets while he's at it, because that's the only way to make space travel economically viable. And the whole space industry is like, who do you think you are? You're not even a rocket scientist, and you think you're going to saunter in here and invent reusable rockets and colonize Mars? You don't think we thought of reusable rockets? We thought of reusable rockets. It's hard. It's really hard. And that's because going through the atmosphere creates an immense amount of stress on your materials, and things burn up, and then landing is hard. Everything about it is hard. You're not going to do it. If all the entire expertise and resources and asset base of the global space industry has not been able to do it, you're not going to do it. He's like, I think I can do it. That's self-efficacy. I mean, beautiful, big, shiny, brazen self-efficacy. And of course, as you know, he did it. All of the innovators I studied had this incredible self-efficacy. And in fact, if you ever get a chance, you need to read a couple biographies of Nikola Tesla. Don't read just one. Because if you read, he's easy to dislike. So depending on which one you get, you could come away going, that guy was a real asshole. And in some ways, he had some asshole-ish qualities, as they all did. But Nikola Tesla was also magical and wonderfully vulnerable and brilliant and gifted and manic and had extremely high self-efficacy. And that's what it takes, because self-efficacy is going to make you take on things that other people say is impossible. And if you have this intense belief that you can overcome all obstacles to achieve your goals, you are way more likely to persist in the face of failure and criticism. And that's what gives you perseverance. So it's going to make you take on bigger projects and stick with them and work on them harder. And sometimes it will make people say you're delusional or you're a dreamer or you're a pompous jerk. And that's when it becomes useful to have the separateness because you're like, I don't care. So, all right, the downside, there can be a line, the line between self-efficacy and mania or delusions of grandeur is a blurry one. And in fact, I really think the line between self-efficacy and mania is whether or not you get it done. Because a lot of these people have clear manic signs, but if they get it done, then they're geniuses, and we think that's high self-efficacy. And if they don't get it done, then we just think they're cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. So, the other thing that came out, again, I wasn't looking for it. It was really surprising. It was especially surprising because I couldn't find, it was very difficult to find much research on this in my field, which is management and innovation, and also psychology. There's not that much research on it. And it's idealism. So all the people I studied, with the exception of Edison, who's an interesting holdout on this one, were extremely idealistic. They were pursuing some goal that they saw as intrinsically noble and more important than themselves, and it fueled them. And then it starts to make sense because, Amabile taught us that intrinsic motivation is better for creativity, right? Intrinsic motivation is a more powerful motivator. But intrinsic motivation also, idealism. Idealism is a form of ego defense, it turns out, too. So if you study Benjamin Franklin, for example, he took a lot of abuse in his career. He had great times and he had tough times. And he never stopped and he never lost faith in his mission because it wasn't about him. It didn't matter if he made money or if people liked him or if he had gout and had to ride a horse across the country because he was serving God. He was serving God and his country and a higher belief about the need for a libertarian and egalitarian America. And so you see a lot of self-sacrifice in these stories. You see it in Marie Curie, you'll see it in Tesla, you'll see it in Elon Musk. A lot of self-sacrifice because they're pursuing an idealistic goal and it makes them work harder and longer and be more to persevere harder. And so here it's, if you know who Dean Kamen is, you guys know who Dean Kamen is? So Dean Kamen, I'm going to tell you what you should know about him, and then I'll tell you the thing that you guys all do know about him. Dean Kamen actually invented the world's first portable drug infusion pump. So if you've seen a type 1 diabetic with a little pump that measures their blood sugar and administers silicone and keeps them alive, that was Dean Kamen. That was revolutionary, hugely, hugely important innovation. He also invented the world's first portable dialysis machine, which was so liberating because you used to have to go to the hospital and spend hours hooked up to a giant machine, and that just disrupts your life, your family, your dignity, everything. He invented the first wheelchair that could climb stairs and that could stand someone up to eye level because he believed that was really important for restoring human dignity. And it was that balancing technology of a wheelchair that can stand on two wheels that led to the Segway, which is the thing you guys all definitely have heard of. So really a prolifically, incredibly productive innovator who's won the Medal of Honor and all these things. And the most amazing part of it is no training in medical science whatsoever. No college degree, not entirely clear he graduated high school, but did all of these things because he saw a need for them, and that need was more important than anything else. I won't even bother this because I pretty much said all of it already. I think I said all that too. So these things actually work in combination. It's kind of interesting. So separateness, if you're separate from people, you're going to get less exposure to norms. You're also going to be less motivated to conform. If you have high self-efficacy and you believe you can overcome goals, you may not believe other people's limitations apply to you, which makes you less motivated to conform, and you believe in your own ability to generate your own unique solution. If you're idealistic, you may do what you believe is right regardless of what other people want you to do because you have that ego defense, and you might be motivated to pursue a really important problem, and all of these things can help make you more likely to generate and pursue breakthrough ideas. And the most wonderful part about it, I'm not going to walk through all these individually because there's too many. The most wonderful part is you can cultivate all of these. These are all learnable and trainable. And you don't even have to be weird or autistic or a genius to do them. So that's the great news. Now, since I'm already halfway through and I promised you a whole separate paper, let's talk about the next one real quick. Okay, so where do these ideas come from structurally in the brain? Like, how does the cognition of it work? And in my field, we often think of technology as a landscape. So we think of there being these exceptional peaks of opportunity and these valleys where opportunities are poor or sparse. And one of the things that you discover if you track learning or innovation in almost any field is that most learning comes from other learning, right? Everything's incremental. If I invent something here, it spawns adjacent opportunities and it helps me see other things I can do in this particular space. So most search is local because it's efficient, and most production of innovation is going to be adjacent to other innovation. But once in a while, you get innovations that are just, they look like they're out of nowhere. They look really disconnected from the rest of the world of innovation. And this has, in the words of Lee Fleming, this is like recombinant uncertainty. And when we recombine unfamiliar components, we might get something really odd. And our expectation is that it would generally fail. But once in a while, we may also get the big breakthroughs there, right? Because it hasn't been farmed, right? So if we explore totally new areas of the landscape where we've never been before, most of the time it's going to just be, desert or swamp or non-arable land. But that's also where we might find gold, right? Those are the places where it hasn't been completely mined out already. So outliers are risky and they're rare. We're going to look at patents in this particular data set. So a lot of the risk has already been screened out because a lot of outlier patent applications probably don't become granted patents. But once in a while, these outlier innovations bloom, and they bloom almost like bacteria on a petri dish. So if I back you up through that, this is the first year when you start seeing, what years does it have it on there? 1979. You first start seeing biotech patents, and there's sparse, a few little patents that get labeled basically as biotech. And that space rapidly fills until you get like a huge cluster by 1985. So you're seeing that bloom of a new area where there was a radical outlier innovation that leads to all this subsequent innovation. And on the one hand, my assumption going into this would be that on average, they'll be less impactful on average. You'll have the big breakthroughs, but you'll have a lot of chaff. You'll have a lot of stuff that'll fail and have no impact. Turns out that assumption was wrong, because on average, outlier patents have they both have a higher average citation rate, and they're more likely to be breakthroughs. So outlier innovation, doing stuff that's in unusual spaces, could be pretty important for breakthroughs, but how the heck do you find an opportunity in uncharted space? Something really disconnected from everything else. And we have a really interesting measure, by the way, of outlier patents that we publish in Research Policy, and if I have time, I'll go through it. But we're talking about things that just aren't adjacent to anything else. They have, based on all the subclasses in them, they have a combination of subclasses that's at least 2 steps away from every other patent in the database. So how are scientists or inventors going to discover opportunities in these unknown spaces, right? If they're completely unknown, how do we get there? So we ended up using a cognitive network approach to basically generate some processes by which we expected inventors or scientists to use to find opportunities in these unusual spaces. And then we used interviews with scientists to see what they said about their outlier innovations. We actually reached out to inventors on outlier patents. They're kind of hard to find, but once you find them, they'll talk a blue streak. And then we also use this really cool data set from the patent database. And the 3 processes we're going to look at are scientific reasoning, long search paths, and distant recombination. And we're arguing that these mechanisms are mechanisms that can enable you to identify opportunities in unusual spaces, which means that if we look at the population of patents that are in unusual spaces, we might see these processes disproportionately represented in them. Now, it's not comprehensive, it's not mutually exclusive, we're not conducting a horse race, we're not saying one's better than the other. We just wanted to see if we can find evidence of them. And we did, and it's super cool. So here's the first one, scientific reasoning. So in scientific reasoning, you're basically using a theory or a structurally analogous problem to go from a problem space to a solution. And once you look at this structurally, like from a network diagram, there's a really interesting implication here, and that is that analogical transfer. A lot of you are familiar with analogical transfer. Analogical transfer is essentially implicit theory application. So you're implicitly creating a theory and then maybe inducing it, and then you're deducing that that theory can solve this new problem. So it's super cool to think about the relationship between analogical transfer and implicit theory application, which is sort of fun. But a nice example here, well, Feng Zheng and the CRISPR Cas9 case is a really cool one because, Doudna Charpentier, they were one of the first people to patent the process by which prokaryotes use gene editing. They use the Cas9 CRISPR to basically gene edit their enemies or gene edit themselves against their enemies. And they patented it for prokaryotes, which is super cool. Gene editing tool for prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are single-celled organisms. But Feng Zhang was like, that should be generalized to eukaryotes because that's the rest of the world. That's us. We're all eukaryotes, as are all the other animals that are out there. And so he generalized and got the patent for doing the exact same thing but for eukaryotes, which was much more valuable. And I think of this a lot. I think of it's kind of similar to me as when the Dutch sailed and discovered Tasmania. And then later on, they're like, shit, why don't we go further and get Florida? You know? But, sorry, somebody else said they were going to have jokes, and I thought I should have a joke. Nitric oxide, we talked to the inventors of this nitric oxide coating for medical devices, and it's a coating that prevents restenosis, so for stents and stuff, it prevents tissues from bonding onto the medical tools. And what you see here is clear use of a theoretical deduction from science model that basically enabled these scientists to say something that had never been done, that in fact people thought couldn't be done, should totally be doable. And the money quote in here is that he said, I argued you can control it. Its chemistry was such that it should be amenable to binding to an amino acid called cysteine, and I demonstrated that to be the case. And I deduced with some chemistry it would happen, and I turned out to be right. So this completely changed how medical devices were made, and it was just a complete turn in how they produced them based on a scientist applying some chemical logic. This next one, this one's really fun. This is an area where Dean and I actually butt heads a little bit, and it has to do with long search paths. So a lot of times outlier innovations, they look like they came out of nowhere. They look like they're random. They look like it was the result of random remote association, something like that. And I end up finding or arguing and then finding that most of the time it's not random. Most of the time it's just a longer search path than the rest of us were following. And because we weren't following such a long search path, that person ends up to someplace where to us we're like, what? How did you get to there? I mean, it looks random, but it's not actually random if you followed the path. So, it's actually very consistent with work by Benedict and Neubauer, who find that people with exceptional working memory and executive function can follow associations with greater speed and greater agility, and as a result, they end up scoring really high on remote association tests. But it's not that they immediately went to the remote associations, it's that they just got through so many more associations than everyone else so much faster that they end up at the remote ones, whereas the other people don't. So that's interesting, because another thing that came out in these studies of the innovators is a lot of them had exceptional memory. A lot of them are noted for either having photographic memory or eidetic memory or just an astounding memory. And memory could be a key in all this because memory enables you to follow a longer path. But I'm going to give you my favorite example, which is BioSteel spider silk, which is spider goats. So if somebody told you, oh yeah, these guys invented spider goats and they lactate spider silk, you might think that was like a creation of Marvel, right? That sounds like a really good Marvel movie. It sounds totally fantastical and bizarre and strange. And yet if you follow the path that Jeffrey Turner and Costas, I can't remember his last, I can't even pronounce his last name, followed, it's actually entirely reasonable. Because Jeffrey Turner was doing his PhD on genetically editing cow bovine mammary glands to produce lactose-free milk. And we've known for a long time that we need lactose-free milk. And so he was working on genetically editing cows to make lactose-free milk. And then at some point he realized, cows are terribly impractical. What you want is a small animal that takes up less space, eats less space, reproduces earlier and more often, and lactates early. So he ends up creating the breed early, lactate early pygmy goat. So it's a genetically modified goat that's small. It breeds early, it lactates early. That's a good animal if you want to study things going on in the mammary gland. And then at some point he's like, okay, I can make the cows make lactose-free milk, but actually I can make them make just about anything. I can make them make just about any protein in their milk. So what would be the highest value protein that I could come up with? And he's like, spider silk. Now, you might be thinking that's a weird jump there, but spider silk has the highest strength to weight ratio of anything we've ever discovered on the planet. Supposedly a rope of spider silk the size of your pinky will stop a Boeing 747 in mid-air flight. It's crazy strong. So if you combine, but the problem is spiders, they're terrible to farm. Spiders are angry, they eat each other, they're hard to milk, very, very difficult creatures. So if you can find an efficient way to make spider silk proteins, that could be an incredible gold mine. And that's exactly what these guys set about. It was this long path. And they didn't patent all the intermediate steps along the way, in part because they weren't sure how valuable that would turn out to be, and in part because they didn't want to tip off everybody what they were doing. But I have this great quote from Kostas Karatsas, who says, "From saying yes to Jeff to where we brought it with investment and research was quite a ride. There were lots of small incremental steps along the way. You go from a piece of DNA all the way to something soluble, but that's not the end of it. All of the other companies would stop there. Here you have the goat, but you're way far away from the final product because the goat is now your starting material. You need to take it and modify it to become a fiber, and that fiber has to become a product." So it was just a really long path, nothing random about it, but a longer path than a lot of us would have taken. Now, you might be wondering what happened to those spider goats. So Jeffrey Turner ran out of money, but both the Navy and the Army swooped in and seized that technology, and so who knows what they're doing with the spider goats today. There's another example here, but I'm going to skip it. Next one, distant recombination. So this one is kind of maybe more familiar in the literature, and this is the idea that sometimes you get to an unusual spot because you connect two other things that appeared unconnected, right? Two different fields that didn't look, you didn't realize that relationship was there, but when you find a solution that combines these two things together, you end up someplace in the middle that had never been explored before. You might get there because you're using broader search and considering different kinds of solutions to where you're going. You might have different kinds of people working on your team who are bringing different skill sets together. One of the interesting things we thought that this brings up is the question of whether or not you need a team that is multiple different kinds of specialists, or whether you're better off with generalists, or do you need a team with specialists and a generalist? So that's one of the things we're going to test in the data. But the example I'm going to give you is the Pillcam. How many of you guys are familiar with the Pillcam? Okay, so more of you who are over the age of 45 and male should get familiar with the Pillcam. You'll be happy that you did. So Gabriel Idun was a guided missile designer for the Israeli army. Eitan Skapa was a gastroenterologist, and they happened to be renting houses next door to each other I think it was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, if I recall correctly, during some sabbatical period. And Eitan came over to Gabriel Idun and is like, you ought to create one of those guided missiles for the human gut. Like, he probably thinks that's a little funny. And Gabriel's like, what do you mean? It's like, well, the intestinal system of the human being, again, a lot of imagery I'm invoking today, which is a little, maybe too much information, is complicated, right? It's very easy for us to get to the stomach. And it's very easy for us to get to the first part of the other part. But there's a big windy bit in the in-between that's quite hard to get to, very hard to get to. And there's also some parts of the large intestine that are actually hard to get to. And there's lots of problems that can happen in there. And we have cameras on rods, but getting them down or up, it's all not good. And Gabriel's like, And so he designs a little bitty, tiny guided missile, basically. The Pillcam is a little tiny guided missile that you swallow, and it does a beautiful video of your entire intestinal system in about 8 hours, and then it exits the body naturally. And then they can use computer software to analyze the film footage to see if there's anything that is suspicious, like bleeding or whatever. They're creating ones now that have little arms that can take biopsies, which is even creepier. But it's a remarkable product. And it turned out to be pretty successful. There's quite a number of applications where this completely dominates the existing solution. And I'm told that in terms of comfort, 5,000% more comfortable. So Pillcam, really interesting application of combining guided missile technology with gastroenterology. James Martin and Michael Salvati, this is another example. They were looking at how to use magnets to basically extract blood platelets. And here you're hearing someone, this is a slightly different example because this highlights the role of the generalist and also the self-efficacy. But he says, he and I, we didn't limit ourselves to the industry norm. We look at things a little bit different from a different mindset. I work with a lot of different scientists, and it's very unusual to find scientists that will take things they've learned from working on their car or their plumbing at home. It's very unusual to go and find people that will go and look outside of I'm probably saying this terribly, their scientific experience. So I have my scientific experience, but I also have all my life stuff and the things I'm interested in. And it's very unusual to find somebody who can put that together, and that's what I've always tried to do. So let's test these ideas. We have this really cool measure of outlier innovation. We're taking the population of patents filed between 1990 and 2000, inclusive from the USPTO. Once you identify all the outliers, you end up finding that about 121,053 qualify as being outliers, meaning they're at least 2 steps away from every other patent in the data set. It's about 4 million patents. We're also using data from MBER, the Patent Name Matching Project, and the Disambiguated Inventor Database. It's a big, hairy database altogether, and doing a logit specification and seeing if we can predict the likelihood of being an outlier based on measures that we're coming up with of these processes. And that part is a little hairy. But I'm going to talk to you about, actually, maybe I should talk about the measures real quick. So first, application of scientific reasoning. We thought maybe citations to science articles. We got really lucky in that Matt Marks just recently came out with a really cool database that anybody can use for free that identifies how many articles in a patent, how many citations in a patent are to scientific articles. We looked at university assignees and assumed that if a university was assignee on the patent, it was more likely an application of science. For distant recombination, we're going to look at 2 different things. We're going to look at the collective breadth of a team, like the experience of the whole inventing team in all of their prior patenting. So we're going to classify for every inventor on a team, we're going to look through their entire inventing history from 1969 forward, and we're going to classify every single patent they've ever filed and look at all the classes they've patented in. And we're going to use that to create a collective breadth measure for the team on any given focal patent. And then we're also going to look at we're also going to identify the person on the team who has maximum individual breadth, like that person on the team who is individually patented in the most different classes, to see how much that individual breadth or that Renaissance man, that generalist matters versus the collective breadth of the team. And then we control for a bunch of things, like how many patents they've patented in before, how many people are on the team, stuff like that. So, and what we end up finding, first of all, the results for citation of science are okay, time's kind of up. We find some good stuff. All right, we do find evidence, in particular for university assignees. Patents with university assignees are far more likely to be outlier patents. So that's pretty interesting. One of the most interesting things we found was actually around the breadth. So it turns out both the collective breadth and the individual breadth matter. So the implication there is that if you want breakthrough innovations, your ideal team might be one that has both breadth across specialists in your team and has a generalist on the team, because both they additively matter. Like it increases your likelihood of an outlier innovation by even more to have both of those on your team. And the last thing I'm going to say, lots of caveats that I would have gone through and lots of brilliant insights I would have made if I had time, but overall, there's a lot of evidence that we can increase the likelihood of breakthrough innovation. We can increase the likelihood of following search paths that lead to breakthrough innovation. We can increase the likelihood of our children, our employees, our colleagues, and ourselves of being more innovative. So to me, I found that very inspiring, and I'll end there. Thank you.
Put the last slide up.
What?
Put the slide up before so people can see it.
Okay, sorry. Uh-oh, it's gone.
That's right.
Okay, we want this one. Okay. The last paper, by the way, is a paper that's forthcoming in Organization Science. So the stuff on breakthrough innovators is a book called Quirky, and then the stuff on outlier patents is a paper forthcoming in Org Science. And is there a protocol for where to start with the questions? I can't even see back there.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I've heard it said that the greatest achievement of Richard Feynman was the idea of Richard Feynman, and it seems like, tying into the previous talk, there are some sort of second order effects having to do with sort of associating personality types with breakthrough innovation, right?
Yeah.
And so one of those is, I'm not saying about Richard Feynman specifically, but sort of people presenting themselves as sort of part of a personality archetype, whether or not they are, because they want their ideas to be taken more seriously or something. And then the other question is if someone doesn't think of themselves as fitting into this sort of narrowly defined personality type, you know, sort of innovation becoming less inclusive.
Okay.
So do you have thoughts on those sort of second order effects and how
Sure.
they sort
It
of
was
tie
a
into?
big, vague, broad question, but I'm going to go after it anyway. So I studied all these people from childhood. And what was interesting is that all of them had signs of their innovativeness from very, very young age. So before they were probably actively self-monitoring and managing their personality and its perception of others, a lot of them became very conflicted later in life about managing their personas, in part because, I'll give you, Thomas Edison's a great example. If you don't know Thomas Edison well, you've heard that he worked in a big lab, and you may have heard that he was jocular. If you study him closely, you find that he was actually almost pathologically withdrawn. Like he could be jocular, but did not like social situations. His wife actually wrote about him that he had no friends. He couldn't socialize with other people because of the man that he was and the life that he led. And yet he knew that coming across as the wizard was important for getting support and getting, achievement. He loved achievement. He had extremely high need for achievement. So he had this sort of conflicted relationship where sometimes he would manage how the press would come to him and perceive him versus who he was in private life. So I do think that most of them, most of them you can see the innovativeness very, very young. So that's not going to be a function, I don't think, of managing the perception of them. Now you had a second part, I think, maybe I missed it.
Yeah, sort of inclusivity and sort of second order effects around sort of associating possibly immutable personality types with achievement.
No, so one of the things that I found most encouraging about this research, and again, I wasn't looking for that going in. I had some priors that just totally different from what I ended up finding. But I think it's actually very supportive of neurodiversity. And I think what you find is that a lot of people could get more access to the support systems that they need to have their innovations enacted and adopted and executed, disseminated, if we could embrace weirdness a little better. Like if we could be more comfortable with weirdness. So I think the issue is that a lot of times people try not to be weird, right? Because they're told they need to be charismatic or they need to be popular. And I think that's a kind of a shame, because what we really should be doing is loving them even in their weirdness. And one of the places where I saw it so clearly was that I had read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. I want to go out on the line here and I'm going to say, Malcolm, you got something wrong. And he's got this whole thing about this guy named, I think his name's Chris Bingham. Chris something, who had been a genius, one of the termite geniuses, super geniuses, who didn't go on to be particularly successful. And he contrasts this guy with this young girl who gets totally trained to be a symphony musician. And he basically makes this argument that we need concerted cultivation because we have to teach these kids how to negotiate for themselves and to be confident and to be charismatic, because that's the key to being successful and not successful. And when I read that, the thing that struck me is that Chris dropped out of Reed College because he didn't have enough money, right, to pay his tuition. Do you know who else dropped out of Reed College because the tuition was too expensive? Steve Jobs. Now, you think Steve Jobs spent a lot of time worrying about being liked by other people? Steve could be charismatic, but he could also be difficult as hell. And the difference between Chris and Steve wasn't concerted cultivation. Steve Jobs did not grow up with cultivated parents who got him music lessons and debate club and things like that. What he grew up with was a profound sense of self-efficacy. He was going to bend the world to his will, which is why Chris left Reed and Steve stayed and just didn't pay the tuition, right? So I love that story. I don't know if that actually gets at your question exactly the way you intended, but thanks. Someone over here?
Yeah, thank you. A short question and then a longer one. The short question is, how do you operationalize outliers? And then the longer question is, if you could just give us some quick take-home tips for how to excel.
Cool. So, so operationalizing outliers, for the patent thing, it was interesting. We had actually previously, Barak Aronson and I had done a study where we mapped the USPTO by taking all the mainline subclasses. So the USPTO has these mainline subclasses of every technological component in a patent. And we basically, you get these really long binary matrices, and you can create adjacency matrices. And at one point, we even created a giant network with it so we could see how far every patent was from every other patent. So we still have that data, the distance between every patent in the world. And we were using it to create footprints for companies and evolutionary paths for companies. We were looking how paths of companies correlate. And at some point, we realized, hey, we've got these other guys who are like not even connected to the network. Like, look at these weird patents that are not connected to the network. And I was like, light bulb, because I love weird stuff. So we just made a mental note to come back and look at the weird stuff. And so Outliers is operationalized. The technical term is weird stuff. I'm being a little bit glib, but it's got a very nice mathematical measure that you can use in the back, and it's actually an even easier way now with some data from Lee Fleming. So if anybody's interested in that, there's a nice algorithm and a data set that you can use to not only measure whether something's an outlier, but how far it is from other patents, which is super cool. Tips. One of my favorite, there's a bunch of tips, lots and lots of tips. But I'll tell you, one of my favorite ones is that I think self-efficacy is kind of like the closest thing humans have to a superpower. Because when you have high self-efficacy, you work harder, you take more risks, and you like it more, right? You enjoy more, higher sense of well-being. And so if we can cultivate self-efficacy in people, that's extremely useful. Of course, the way that we know cultivate self-efficacy most effective is early wins. So setting people up, letting kids try things that you think they can probably muddle through. And what that means, the biggest thing that means is that as a parent, you don't jump in and help all the time, right? So like sometimes you feel like if your colleague is struggling with something, you should jump in and help because it's good for social bonding, it's cohesion, right? It shows that you're a supportive team player. But if you think they can get through it on their own, sometimes your best bet is to say, you've got this. I have total faith in you. Give it a try, And so this is maybe part of why you often find that breakthrough innovators had really laissez-faire parents, which is interesting. But there's an even easier way. It turns out humans are wired, as are most social animals, for vicarious learning, which means a big part of how I figure out whether I can climb that or jump that or eat that has to do with seeing whether you guys do, right? So if you go over there and you eat berries from that bush and you die, I'm like, okay, I'm good. I'm not going to eat those berries, right? And so we're wired for that, which means when you see people overcome obstacles to achieve their goals, every time you see that, there's a little part of your social mammal brain going, look what I can do. So this is why I think hero stories are so powerful. Reading stories about people who overcame difficult circumstances or obstacles to achieve their goals. Every time we make people read those or we read them ourselves, we integrate some of that into our own DNA.
Thank you.
Probably not technically, that would be like an epigenetic argument, but thank you. Someone over here?
Thank you. Fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering about especially the first part of the talk, where you showed us essentially very predictably for a wide range of people, they all share a certain kind of characteristics. And then it's just, so that seems to say, well, the finding is great because it seems to say then if you improve on these characteristics like self-efficacy and others, then you might improve your odds of becoming maybe one of them, right? So and that's great. So, but whenever I follow this line of reasoning, then usually there are two groups of people they jump up and down, right? The first group of people will say, well, just because they have certain characteristics doesn't mean they are them because of that. And the second group of people, aka economists, the second group of people will jump up and down and say, well, maybe there's survivorship bias because only the ones who succeeded get to talk the story. So maybe when you say the idea of, well, you got to take the risk, what do you have to lose? There are a million others who did the same thing but never get to talk about it. And and particularly the counterfactual in those cases could be orders of magnitude more than what we actually study.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you can actually sort of conceptualize the finding and tell us more about, in light of these two school of thoughts, like how do we need to think more about this, or like how do we conceptualize the finding?
Yeah, so first of all, it's definitely not some sort of deterministic additive model. And it's not like a soup where if we add some self-efficacy and we add a little separateness, we get, better soup. These are just factors that these people had in common. It may mean that you need a whole lot of them. And in fact, all the people that I studied are actually also extremely intelligent. So there's a baseline part that's harder to tap there. And they're also, your second piece is is important, and that is that some of these things may also radically increase the likelihood of being a spectacular failure, right? And I'm totally agnostic to that in that particular study, because I'm studying the propensity to pursue breakthrough innovation, but breakthrough innovation can be you can have breakthrough failure, you can have radical failure too. And I can't predict that I don't know how to put this exactly. It could be either one, right? I'm just saying that if you're looking to get more breakthrough innovation in your firm, for example, you're gonna have to celebrate more failure. You're gonna have to make bold failures, and you're gonna have to learn from them. So the whole argument there is that you have to be willing to fail. If you want to also, you have to be willing to fail big sometimes if you want to have the possibility of succeeding big. And breakthrough innovation also, I want to make another thing clear, not for everybody, right? And certainly not for the faint of heart. Like a lot of these people did not have the kind of life that you want to have or that you would want your kid to have. A lot of them were so maniacally focused on their work that they sacrificed everything, including their health or their families. I mean, it's very stark how many of them sacrificed their families to their pursuit of breakthrough innovation. So this is not meant to be a prescriptive, do what they did and you'll be successful and happy story. It's just here's how we can manage breakthrough innovation story. And you want to be careful the pieces you learn from this. Some of these pieces, separateness is a great one. You don't want to advise someone to be more separate, probably. Well, you might want to advise someone to care less about what people think of them. That can be valuable. Like I think where it's really valuable is like I had a kid who didn't make friends and wore a lot of black and was just, kind of goth, even in elementary school. And I bought this book, How to Help Your Kid Make Friends. And I was like trying to coach her. And then I started studying these people and I realized that whole process of trying to coach her of how to make friends was signaling her that who she wasn't okay. And really I abandoned all of that. And I just decided, no, let your freak flag fly. Be you, because who you are is great. And I personally found it very liberating because I'm often at home on a Friday night in front of my computer and I used to beat myself up about that. And now I'm like, I'm just weird. That's okay. That didn't really answer your question, but.
We're going to have to take the break now, so please ask the questions during the break.